Jordan Marsh was something that was not only a large department store, but it had competitors within the neighborhood. You began to realize that the downtown crossing of the area of Summer Street, Winter Street, and Washington Street that we call it today now had new department stores: Filene's, Gilchrist, Conrad and Chandler, R.H. White, R.H. Stearns. And they all provided wonderful accompaniments, but the idea was that young Jordan wanted this to be quite important.
Okay, our distinguished speaker this evening is Anthony Mitchell Sammarco. He is a noted historian and author of 70 books on the history and development of Boston, and he lectures widely on the history and development of his native city.
It's a pleasure to be here. It was founded by two men, Debutante Jordan, seen here, and Benjamin L. Marsh. These two men, who were actually neighbors on Hanover Street in the north end of Boston, began in 1841 to actually sell wholesale dry goods. And throughout that period, for a decade, they did quite well. But they joined together in 1851 to establish what was then called Jordan and Marsh. And at that point, they were located on Hanover Street, where they would stay for 5 years. Later, they would move to Milk Street, and later, Winthrop Square. It wouldn't be until 1871 that they moved to Washington Street, between Avon Place and Summer Street. And at that point, the company, which had expanded rapidly, would actually eventually have 2 acres of display space that went the gamut from everything between summer whites, as well as linens, furs, trunks, suitcases, and of course, everything that one needed to equip the house. But during the 19th century, you began to realize, with Boston's spreading aspect, Boston by 1880 had now incorporated the individual towns such as Dorchester, Brighton, and West Roxbury, as well as the former cities of Charlestown and Roxbury as annexed neighborhoods. Now, Boston had a burgeoning middle class. And the concept was that the company didn't just have display space in downtown Boston, but they also began to publish catalogs. As early as the 1870s, these catalogs, which were between 75 and 100 pages and profusely illustrated, would actually show in some ways not just the things that were available, but they could be ordered through the mail. Well, seen here, you began to realize that it wasn't just this building, which was constructed in 1884, designed by Winslow and Weatherall, the successor firm to Nathaniel Bradley, but you also saw in some ways the original building called the Jordan and Marsh in 1841 at Mechanic and Hanover Streets in the North End, Milk Street in 1851, Winthrop Street in 1861, and of course Washington Street in 1871. The whole concept here was, it was a full-service company. And in many ways, these two men did extremely well. And by the latter part of the 19th century, the company itself would sprawl through a series of buildings on either side of Avon Street, which would be just to the right. In some aspects, as I mentioned, it wasn't just the original department store, but an annex that would later see another one directly across the street at Bedford Street. And seen here, Washington Street in 1906 was a thriving thoroughfare with people not only as pedestrians, but horse-drawn wagons. And I've always loved, in some aspects, the little boy carrying the hat boxes. You look at this and you began to realize that Jordan Marsh was something that was actually to be reckoned with. It wasn't just an important feature, but entering into the store, you began to realize that Winslow and Weatherall, who didn't just design the store, but would actually produce all of the furniture and accoutrements for the department store, were equally sumptuous. And seen here, this was a waiting room where you would actually have furs brought to you. And the seats themselves were beautifully done, all designed by Davenport Peters, a very well-known design company. But it was also the fact that the display space was actually incredible. And seen here, this was the men's furnishing department in the main store. And if you look, you begin to realize it wasn't just shirts, collars, of course socks, and all sorts of ties, but you began to realize that Jordan Marsh was providing all sorts of things that were necessary. So whether it was clothing, household furnishings, or even things such as children's toys, Jordan Marsh could actually provide it. They also went the gamut from things that you could actually provide for your home. I like this because it was their art parlor, and on the 4th floor you began to realize it was all sorts of art pottery. Art pottery at the turn of the 20th century was an important feature. It wasn't just used for vases, much of it was used for display, but it was something that was unique, and it was also part of a department store experience. So it wasn't just art pottery, but you'd also have their picture gallery. And the picture gallery began as early as 1884. And Jordan Marsh realized that if they had special events that would bring people in this instance maybe to meet the artist, the people would stay and possibly purchase things within the department store. Well, it went the gamut, and they had some extremely well-known artists of the period. John Enneking would actually produce art that was displayed here, and of course the Landsill brothers. And I swear to God, this painting hangs in my bedroom in Austerville. Looking at it, you began to realize it was a full-service company, but it also included clothing. And in the late 19th century, women could actually choose through a wide array of accessories, as well as clothing that was made from any type of material totally available. And here, as it says, ladies' suits, and this is probably from about 1905, you began to realize it would go the gamut from all sorts of silks, but the things were available not only in person, but by mail order. And one of the displays here is a great example of the different cuts of material that a woman could choose from. I enjoy them because if you look in the distance, you begin to realize this is Boston Public Garden, the Arlington Street Church, and the gateways into the Back Bay. And you see these things along with all sorts of different things, including the bustle, and further down on Commonwealth Avenue, the fashion of the day. But it was always available at no extra cost for different materials. Well, during this period of time, it wasn't just women's fashion, but even men. And it says here, gentlemen's and chauffeurs' fur and fur-lined coats were available. Well, in the winter, maybe you're not old enough to remember, but most automobiles were unheated prior to 1950. And the concept here was that these fur coats, whether they were full fur or lined fur, was something that driving would provide heat. It was something here that for $150, which at the turn of the century was a tremendous sum of money, was something that would actually provide a fashion statement, but also keep you warm. So by the period of the turn of the century, Ebediah Jordan himself would see his son come into the partnership. Ebediah Jr., who actually had attended Harvard College but never graduated, was someone who was taken into partnership by 1884. He himself, unlike his father, began to realize that Jordan Marsh was something that was not only a large department store, but it had competitors within the neighborhood. You began to realize that the downtown crossing of the area of Summer Street, Winter Street, and Washington Street that we call it today now had new department stores: Filene's, Gilchrist, Conrad and Chandler, R.H. White, R.H. Stearns. And they all provided wonderful accompaniments, but the idea was that young Jordan wanted this to be quite important. He was also a great philanthropist. And at the turn of the 20th century, we began to realize it wasn't just Jordan Hall, which was endowed by him and given as a gift, but also he would actually pay for the Boston Opera House to be built. Edmund March Wheelwright would design it on Huntington Avenue, just west of Symphony Hall. And you began to realize that thanks to the profits of Jordan Marsh, that this man himself would actually see tremendous profits reinvested in the community. He would take into partnership a man by the name of Edward Mitten. And Edward Mitten was born and raised in Britain, but he started at Jordan Marsh as a box boy. And in the 1870s and early 1880s, he worked for both the founders as well as their son. And in some ways, during the period of the late 1890s and the turn of the 20th century, he began to interpret Jordan Marsh as something that he too could contribute to. And during that period of time, you began to realize that Jordan's, when you entered that wonderful door with the canopy directly above, and this was the door on Summer Street at the corner of Washington, that it was a special place. The interior was equally sumptuous to the exterior, designed by Winslow and Weatherall. And it was something in a lot of ways that people began to realize that all of the different stations themselves would really go the gamut. And as you see here in the main store, the center aisle had women's gloves and neckwear. Now, can you imagine on both sides, these entire areas with drawers would provide all sorts of different colors, all sorts of different gloves, all sorts of different materials. But women themselves could actually sit on these stools and actually test all of the pieces. That was the one thing about Jordan Marsh. Every counter had 2 clerks to actually serve the public. And during this period of time, with ferns and of course a wonderful clock, you began to realize that this was becoming what a department store should be, all service. But it also provided things that you could actually acquire for your home. I love this postcard. It probably dates to about 1909. The woman is seated quite grandly as oriental carpets are enrolled and showed to her. The men themselves in the distance actually were the men who would acquire these. Jordan Marsh at the turn of the 20th century would have dozens of buyers going to Europe to acquire things, whether it was clothing or the latest fashion, or in this instance, oriental carpets. But in a lot of ways, it was also the fact that Jordan Marsh provided all sorts of different services that either you could pay cash or charge. Now, if you were to pay cash at one of the counters, your money would then be sent through what were called the pneumatic tubes. Now, if you look above, these tubes themselves would be connected throughout the store, and they would actually be small cylinders where the money was placed. It was then brought to these women who would change it and provide the exact change that was returned to the customer. It's incredible, but you might realize many banks still have drive-through pneumatic deposits that you can send if you're in an opposite lane. But if you didn't choose to pay in cash, Jordan Marsh was one of the first stores in Boston to extend credit. Now, a credit card is something that most of us take for granted. A credit card is necessary in many instances to rent a car. But at the turn of the 20th century, if one wanted credit at Jordan Marsh, it wasn't a card, it was a token that was actually provided. Now, these tokens themselves are no more than 1.5 inches in height, but they were something that was marked by the exact number that was then assigned to you. You did not have to pay the bill at the end of the month, but a service charge would actually be applied. And it was one of the first concepts in Boston to actually see people extending credit to shoppers. And in that way, it broadened the middle class in some ways for their ability to come to Jordan Marsh and partake of the wonderful displays. But once you had done your shopping and you wanted to send it home, Jordan Marsh and Company would deliver it free of charge. And seen here, these 2 men themselves, I don't know, it looks a little rickety to me, but these 2 men on the right-hand side actually place something on the back that's actually covered by insulated blankets. But this was an important way for people to actually get their goods directly returned to their home. Well, Boston, by the turn of the 20th century, was a place that was a thriving thoroughfare, and going to town was a major feature. So whether you took the train or the streetcar for a nickel, when you arrived in downtown Boston, there were all sorts of different places to shop. And seen here with Summer Street, looking from Washington, you see on the left-hand side, Filene's department store, in the distance, Kennedy's, and on the right-hand side, Jordan Marsh. This photograph that dated to the period of World War II actually shows flag for the red feather. Jordan Marsh and Filene's were two major supporters of the Red Feather Club during the war, but it was an important way to realize that people going to town, and mind you, this is pre-suburban shopping malls, would actually look at it as something that was a great treat. Going to town meant that you could actually go to Jordan's in the 1920s and 1930s. Their wonderful catalogs had all of the displayed items that you would see, but in this instance, Modes and Manners from 1927 would show a little bit of an odd assemblage of clothing, and of course a bird in a cage, but the interior itself would have all sorts of different articles and the specials that would actually be there. One of the specials was a shop called the Spanish Shop. And the Spanish Shop in the 1930s to the 1950s was the candy shop. Candy was a big deal, and everything was done as a hand-dipped bonbon within Jordan Marsh itself. And seen here, a woman with her leopard shawl could actually get a pound of candy at the Spanish Shop of all sorts of different varieties of chocolate. It was something that was unique, it was unusual, and though there were candy shops throughout Boston, Jordan Marsh was a full-service company. So whether it was clothing or oriental rugs or candy, you could actually acquire it. But it was also the fact that the Mittens themselves, after Ebediah Jordan Jr.'s death in 1916, would continue it. Not only did Edward Mitten and later his son, Edward R. Mitten, be president successively and would actually cover over 40 years, it was an important way to realize that Mr. Mitten himself was really quite well respected. Seen here, he was president of Jordan Marsh, and he's receiving the 9th annual Toby Award. It was a person that was actually part of American retailing, and he was being honored because, of course, he had taken Jordan Marsh to new heights. And by the 1940s, Jordan Marsh was something that had expanded. Many people looked at it and realized that having been found in 1851, by the time after of the World War II, that the company was so well respected that it was something that would see its first expansion since 1884. Seen here at the corner of Summer Street, this is the building that was designed by Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn for the 100th anniversary of Jordan Marsh. The family, the Mittens, had actually sold off the company to Allied in 1935. But we realize that Jordan Marsh, as part of the Allied chain of stores throughout the United States, continued to expand in Boston. Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn, one of the best-known architectural firms of the 20th century, were well known because of the Rockefeller families hiring them to restore colonial Williamsburg. Jordan Marsh hired the firm to actually build their new store. And seen here, the building still stands, it's part of Macy's, but in 1951 there was a neon sign erected that said the 100th anniversary of Jordan Marsh. It was a big deal. Many businesses in Boston were a century old, but Jordan's decided to do something quite unique, and they actually did a book on the history that was actually told in the third person by a man called the Traveler. The Traveler, seen here in a tri-cornered hat and of course a spyglass, tells the story of Ebediah Jordan and Benjamin Marsh joining forces in 1851 to create what became Boston's first department store. It's a fantastic history, if you can read through it, because it is in the third person, about a man who didn't exist, but would eventually become part of the lore of this department store. Even Sebastian Miniatures and Marblehead made small travelers, and there's something that are even in my study in Boston. But this was an important feature for a centennial of any store in Boston, so it wasn't just the history that was written, which is available widely, but they also did China. And this plate, which was done by Wedgwood, was from 1951 for the 100th anniversary of the store. And if you look on the edge or the rim of the plate were the original stores. You see the building in the north end at the corner of Hanover and Mechanic Street. You see the building on Milk Street. The building designed by Winslow and Wetherall in 1844 at the corner of Washington and Avon Street, and of course, the new building designed just for the centennial. And in that instance, these weren't just available for the centennial, but they also did memorial plates of different sites in Boston. The Old South Meeting House, the Old North Church, Paul Revere's house, the Old State House. Each of these plates also by Wedgwood were things that you too could have at home and revel in its century of history. But you also began to realize in some ways that Jordan's was a place that brought people not only during the day, but on the open evenings, which they were open until 9 o'clock. Looking here, and this is Washington Street at the corner of Summer, hundreds of people would descend upon Jordan Marsh. It was a shopping experience, but there were also days that were called dollar days. And dollar days meant that you were usually given a coupon that looked like a dollar bill, but it was printed in blue. And you could actually take it to Jordan Marsh, and they had specials that were available just for $1. Those were the days. But you could also shop for things such as this, the latest fashion. And for $16.95, you could actually have a dress that she says, "May I have the next waltz, Mr. Strauss?" It was a beautiful dress. It was very inexpensive, but you could also get it, as you see here, in different colors. It was in pink rose, turquoise, Victorian green. It was in violet, brown, and black. And from size 9 to 15, it actually encompassed most of the women. These dresses were important. They were like the fashions of the 1880s and 90s, but you could even have this, the Debutante Gown, and it says it was a new adventure in beauty. These advertisements were things that were usually in the newspaper on Sundays, beautifully illustrated in full color, and of course at a very reasonable price. They were something that brought people to the department store simply to look at or possibly to buy. And the idea was, if you provided quality services, people would actually know and they would come. And doing that, one of the things that they continued were the catalogs. Now in the 19th century, these catalogs, which were usually paper bound and filled with all sorts of different things that you could simply order, usually by telegraph or by mail, would by the 1950s become these full color catalogs, which were really called wish books. Well, this was a wish book for Christmas of 1950, and of course, who else other than Santa Claus, and of course the children in the foreground, could look at this as something that they too could choose from. Up at the top it says Christmas gifts for all the family from New England's largest store. Well, this was filled with everything imaginable. Of course, the children didn't want the clothing or the pajamas, but there were all sorts of toys in the interior that they could choose from. And in some ways, Jordan Marsh, during the holiday season, would bedeck itself, especially at the holidays at Christmas, as we see here in front of the Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn building with the nativity scene. This building, with its wonderful parapet, was something that you would have life-size statues of the Nativity. And it was important to realize that it went all along Tremont Street as well, as Summer Street as well, and that it was something that was really attractive, but it caught the public's attention. During the holidays, you would see all sorts of new things that were actually erected. And here at the corner of Washington and Avon Place, which is the addition that was ended by Winslow and Wetherall, you have Tales from Mother Goose, along with Santa Claus, with a sign that said New England's largest toyland, the 5th floor annex. Well, what child would not want to pass by this building without stopping? Mother and father or grandparents would actually have to come in. It was an important feature to realize that most of the profits for the entire year were made in the 2 months at Christmas time. And we would see in some ways that these enormous plate glass display windows, especially along Summer Street in the new addition by Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn, would not only have, as we see here, New England's largest toyland, but the enchanted village of St. Nicholas. And in the late 1950s, this was a new way to entice the public into Jordan Marsh. The Enchanted Village was envisioned as being something that was a little bit of old England, especially at the holidays, where families could come and revel and hopefully spend some of their money. Well, the Enchanted Village was something that brought thousands of people throughout the season. This was an admission card from 1990, and you actually had to go at a specific time. There were so many people by the latter part, after it was dismantled about 1994, that you realized in some ways that people looked at the Enchanted Village as something that was a tradition, but it was something that families did every year. When you entered, it was something that was not only magical, but it was also something that you would see here, a general store with mannequins that moved. These were beautifully done, beautifully decorated, but they were things in a lot of ways that made people realize that the Enchanted Village was something that was almost magical every year. A drawing room with children, a full tree, rocking horses, something of the Victorian period. And you also saw the hurdy-gurdy man. And these little machines themselves would actually produce tunes. Going through these areas, families began to realize that Jordan Marsh was providing something that was not just entertainment, but it was a lure into the building itself. And as a department store, they provided all sorts of things. It wasn't just the Enchanted Village, but it was also to visit Santa Claus. And seen here, Santa Claus, who would sit on a red velvet throne, would see thousands of children on a weekend basis, but they would also be available to be photographed, and even I would sit on Santa's lap. I won't tell you the year, but I do remember it. In that way, the Enchanted Village, a visit with Santa, and then possibly going to visit Toyland was something that no child could refuse. Some of the pages of these wonderful wish books, and this dates to the 1950s, would actually say rewards for good little girls. I just wonder what bad little girls got, other than a bag of coal. But these rewards were Madame Alexander dolls from Paris. And for $12.95, it was really quite the bargain. But if you looked, Madame Alexander's dolls themselves might even come with a small kit, and you could actually dress and undress the child. But these wonderful dresses themselves began to realize in some ways that they provided not just ready-made dolls, but things that were even imported from Europe. And of course, what did good little boys get? American Flyer or Lionel Trains. I received my own Lionel train when I was born. It's probably still using steam engine, it's so old. But the idea was that a train set was something that young boys would look at and realize that it wasn't just a great treat, but you could also get all of these different accompaniments. And seen here, all of the accessories that would go the gamut, from houses and cross tracks and even mountains, would actually be displayed in Toyland. You would go there and see entire displays of trains that would simply be going 24 hours a day. And people realized how important it was. Children loved it, and they sold extremely well. But in the 1950s and 60s, if you did shop at Jordan Marsh, your holiday gifts were placed into this, a joyous Merry Christmas red box. And what was it? But almost a type of thing from the Enchanted Village. You'd see a tally-ho with people, not only with the wonderful trumpets, but something that was an old English Christmas, complete with snow and a Jordan Marsh Company's shop. These were important features. And as I said, it brought thousands of people in, but it also made a tremendous profit. But also, Jordan's had a bakery. And one of the things about the bakery was it provided all sorts of different things, but they actually wanted bakers that would be trained to work in the bakery. Now, seen here, it says, Jordan Marsh's bakery is famous for its delicious blueberry muffins, and now has an opportunity for an experienced baker or baker's apprentice. Of course, it was an 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, but it was actually quite good because Jordan Marsh actually provided very good employee benefits. But the bakery was best known for what? Its Jordan Marsh blueberry muffins. These muffins were something that one could never resist. If you had come to town, you always had to return with a box of at least 4 Jordan Marsh muffins. The box itself was filled to the brim. These were larger than a tea plate, and they were something covered in sugar that every Bostonian knew and loved. But the bakery was something after you had taken your ticket, and this bakery was actually in the annex, directly opposite Avon Place. You would then speak to the women to actually provide you everything from brownies, fruit cookies, as well as all sorts of things, including the blueberry muffins. It was really quite special, but it also became part of Boston's history. And seen here, the close-up of Washington Street itself, Jordan Marsh and Company was something that was one of many department stores that people patronized. And as I mentioned, it wasn't just the fact that Jordan's had their white sale every January, but they also provided, as I said earlier, dollar days. Now, seen here, if you had a piece of paper that said Jordan Marsh dollar days, you could then take it to actually shop and possibly buy gloves for $1 a pair. Well, this is a photograph from about 1968, and you can see the women themselves looking at all of the different gloves that were available. Dollar days were big business, and the idea was, in some ways, the next step would be the bargain basement. And the concept here was it provided a benefit through a reduction in price. And people took advantage of it, and it was something that Jordan's was quite well known for. Another way they would get people to come into Jordan Marsh was maybe a prominent movie star. Somebody I know actually went to see Sophia Loren at Jordan Marsh and actually have a signed photograph that actually is on our piano. Another person might have gone to actually see the new Polaroid camera. And here, Mr. Land in the distance is actually showing the new Polaroid camera in the late 1940s, early 1950s. It was revolutionary. A Polaroid camera actually provided something within just a few minutes rather than sending it to the photography studio to develop the film. But look at all the people. This was something that brought people in. And whether it was a movie star or a prominent person, or in this instance, a newfangled device, people did come. But the whole concept was that Jordan Marsh would bank on people spending something on their way out. And in that way, it was a great feature. But you too could then be part of some of the things about Jordan Marsh. In the 1950s, they put in escalators. And these escalators were quite unusual. Most people had taken the stairs. But now, if you were to be a Jordan Marsh electric stairway test pilot, you received a small button. If you actually came and you worked on such things as the escalators, the electric stairway would take you up or take you down. You might be given packages to carry, a perambulator, children, but there were all sorts of different ways for you to help Jordan Marsh by becoming a test pilot in this instance. It was something unique, something new, and it made people feel a part of Jordan Marsh. Other things included the suburban sprawl. And by the period of the 1950s, when Jordan Marsh began the construction of that new addition by Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn, you began to see the downtown district beginning to wane. As Boston's population moved further into the suburbs after World War II, thanks to the GI Bill, we saw many young veterans actually now purchasing homes in the suburbs. Of course, shopping malls would be the consequence with the ascendancy of the automobile. And seen here was Framingham's Shoppers World. And Shoppers World would have Jordan Marsh with this enormous dome actually built in such a way as one of the first suburban shopping malls. And by the period of the 1980s, Jordan Marsh had places, all sorts of places in New England, whether it was the North Shore Mall or the South Shore Mall, or in many of the cities and towns surrounding the city. they would also expand to Florida and have a branch called Jordan Marsh, Florida, that would actually have at least 7 distinct stores. But the suburban sprawl was something that then caused Jordan Marsh in downtown Boston to somewhat become affected. Seen here, looking at the entrance itself, it was a place that was special. Once you entered into Jordan Marsh, you began to realize it was only 2 acres of display space, but it was the largest in New England. And it was all founded by Eben Jordan and Benjamin Marsh. These 2 men, in some ways, not only raised the consciousness of New Englanders as to what was available, not only for them but their families, but they provided quality goods, imported goods in many instances, and a wonderful spectrum of quality goods from clothing, oriental rugs, and of course a bakery. Jordan Marsh is the title of my new book. I've been researching this for the last few months, and I began to realize in some ways that my books, which go the gamut from the history of Howard Johnson's and the history of the Baker Chocolate Company, are popular history. They're things that we remember or our family and friends. And in some ways you begin to interpret the concept of what it represents. Jordan Marsh is a special place. It no longer survives. It's now Macy's. But we realize in some ways that it has a fantastic history. One of the things that I would like is there are clipboards on either side of the front. If you have something that you actually would like to share, maybe a name and an email if you have a connection to Jordan Marsh, I'd love to discuss it with you. But one of the things about Jordan Marsh is that though it's no longer in existence, it's a memory, and we want to remember it. In a lot of ways, it was something that was once an important part of the city, especially in its commercial base. But we also realize in some ways it was a wonderful memory from the past. Thank you very much.
I remember growing up and going to a restaurant in Jordan Marsh.
There were restaurants both in Jordan Marsh and in Filene's. And the concept was Jordan Marsh also had a soda fountain. One of the things that always intrigues me about Jordan Marsh is the similarities between Mr. Selfridge. I don't know if anybody watches PBS, but Selfridge's in some ways still maintains, like Fortnum and Mason's, the ideas of what Jordan Marsh was at the turn of the 20th century. And surprisingly, Jordan Marsh had an ice cream fountain. It was in the basement of the annex. And you could actually get all sorts of ice cream that was incredible, but it was confections that were great. But they also had a wonderful dining room, and that dining room was something that was really quite elegant. And Filene's would also have a dining room. So you realized in some ways it wasn't just shopping, it was an experience, and it was something that people came to town for.
I was really curious about the women's gloves and neckwear, the drawers that slide out. So neckwear meant what?
When you think of neckwear, many women actually wore collars. There would be a blouse, and they would actually have a collar, which was detachable, just like a man's collar would be detachable as well. So you could actually have a collar that was lace, or it could be starched linen, or it could be a magnitude of things, but they came in all sorts of different things. And they went the gamut in prices as well. But gloves went from the aspect of lace gloves to kit gloves, and you might even remember gloves that were elbow length. So it was something that provided everything you would possibly need as a department store.
Yes, when did Jordan Marsh install air conditioning? I understand that was in the history of department stores in general worldwide. That was sort of they had the economies of scale that could do this.
Well, air conditioning was actually installed in the Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn edition of 1951. The older parts of the store were never air conditioned until the period of about 1975. And the surprising thing was these were buildings that didn't necessarily use air conditioning to simply cool, but they had interior circulation of exterior air. And in a lot of ways, just simply from the circulation of air, not only through floor but wall vents, it was something that was very comfortable. I've always thought Jordan Marsh was probably the most advanced of the department stores in the 19th century, but I hate to say that I think Filene's eclipsed it when it was built in 1912. Filene's was a much more modern building, and Henry Hardenberg, who designed it, made it in some ways into something that was a unique specialty department store. And whereas Jordan Marsh was 2 acres of display space, no one could compete, but Filene's carved a niche out, as other department stores in Boston did. Some provided such things as handbags or gloves or things of that sort that they were known for. But I think Jordan Marsh in some ways was an all-service, but it was the oldest department store. Well, thank you all so much. I really do appreciate it.
Looking back 240 years, the irony is starkly clear to the modern eye. As the American colonists fought for their freedom, many also fought to keep 1/5 of their population enslaved. Frankly, the founding fathers were well aware of the irony, and so were the Anglo-African slaves themselves, who, imbibing the talk of freedom all around them, struggled in every way possible to claim their rightful liberty.